We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we as people go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is only the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome.
Yes, welcome to Evidence of Design. I'm your host, Jason Taylor, and we're joined in studio by my good friend and co-host, Mary Lawrence.
Good morning. Today's
show is first airing on Saturday, August 1st, 2020. Happy August. I have no idea how we are already in August. The year 2020, everyone's favorite year, I think. Definitely going to go down in the history textbooks as the top year of all years to come. Isn't today the day that we have to go in the field and scream, Mary, and let all of our frustrations out?
Oh, yeah. That is a Facebook event that I had marked myself interested to. It's called Big Field Scream.
Because 2020 is just the awesomest of years. So, we're already in August, 2021.
Somehow.
Let's make it happen now. So thanks for tuning in to your local grassroots and community radio station, 100.9 FM WXIR. For those new to Evidence of Design, our show is all about discussing income and wealth inequality. We think there is too much economic inequality in the United States. We're living through times of historically high economic inequality, where more and more often those with the most income and wealth control more and more of political and social power. We do not think that is right. We investigate where that inequality comes from, what forces produce said economic inequality, and what forces allow millions upon millions of people in the wealthiest and most powerful country in the history of the world to live in, if not in fact actual, then relative poverty, and to have no guaranteed access to housing or to health care, and so on and so forth. So we critique economic inequality, we investigate its causes, and try to figure out what we can do to make our society more equal along all grounds. On today's show, we'll be starting off with the COVID-19 picture, where we're at with COVID-19. We run the numbers every week. Of course, it's not just numbers, it's people's lives being lost and many other things destroyed. And so we will cover where we're at with COVID-19. And for the feature of today's show, we are very excited to be talking about public banking. For those staying tuned to the news here locally in Rochester, New York, you know that city council members, including, for example, Mary Lupien, has been really pushing to start a public bank of Rochester, or just to have public banks writ large throughout New York State. There are other members in the community who have been doing a lot of work pushing for public banking as well, and we'll get to interview at least one of them locally. And so we're very excited to talk about public banks. What are public banks? What effects do they have? How can they actually support the community? How can they actually feed back into and build relationships and not be just solely vehicles for profit? That's what we're talking about today. It'll be very exciting. Because we are live for you for Saturday, August 1st, you're welcome to give us a call at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. 8889. Before we get to the feature for today, it'll take us for the most of our show, around 40 minutes. Mary, let me turn it over to you, and let's go over relatively briefly where we're at with COVID-19. We've been giving kind of dire pictures for the past several updates, for the past several weeks. Mm-hmm. The United States still number one when it comes to COVID-19. Number one in a bad way, isn't that right?
Still number one, yes, in the worst way, of the most recorded cases and most recorded deaths of any other country in the world. So just to take a look at where we are in the world, What we're going to be looking at are reported cases. That's an important note. This is not every single case that exists, but worldwide there are almost 18 million recorded cases of COVID-19. That's throughout the whole pandemic. Currently, there are about 6 million active recorded cases. Of these 17 plus million cases, almost 700,000 worldwide have resulted in death. To narrow in a little bit on COVID-19 in the United States, the U.S. is nearing 5 million recorded cases. We have about 4.7 million at the moment that are currently reported.
If there's around 18 million worldwide cases, the U.S. has around 5 million cases. That means we have a little bit less than a third of all of the cases in the entire world, even though the population of the United States only accounts for 4% of all the people in the entire world.
Right. That's a pretty big chunk and very significant considering we tout our healthcare system as being the best in the world. There's a little bit of a lapse there in our thinking. The U.S. has unfortunately exceeded 150,000 deaths related to COVID-19. As of yesterday, there were 156,772 reported deaths related to COVID-19. And again, I can't say this often enough. These are only things that are reported. There are probably many, many more deaths and cases related to COVID-19. Just a couple notes on what's going on around the country. As of yesterday, Florida has had a 4-day streak of breaking its own records for daily coronavirus deaths. On Friday, there were 257 deaths in the state, and that was, again, the fourth of a streak of increases. And for anyone who's had to apply for unemployment due to losing their job during this pandemic, unfortunately, the Senate did not extend additional benefits. So the extra $600 a week that was being added by federal funds to coronavirus-related unemployment, unfortunately, that has not been extended. So we're not really sure what's going to be happening there.
Yep, so these trends continue. We covered the unemployment benefits on the last show, and that the Republican-controlled Senate, led by Mitch McConnell, was really hung up on thinking that the safety net from our government is too large and generous, and therefore they did not want to extend the unemployment benefits in the way they were going, because they said that the unemployment benefits discouraged people from going to work. That is a tried and that is a well-used argument in more conservative circles to say that we don't want to incentivize people to be lazy. I don't believe in that narrative at all. Yes, of course it will apply to some people, but not large enough to have it be the stereotype that one uses to form their political arguments off of. I love working for the sake of work. Maybe that's unique, but I find meaning out of work, and a lot of work I tend to do, kind of like this radio show, is for free, and just as an example, so it's just sort of a really sad and petty thing, I think, and we should be supporting people's humanity and ability to live their lives, as opposed to thinking about any other sort of economic imperative first and foremost.
Not to mention, at the moment, I think that we should be incentivizing people to stay home, because again, the United States is leading the number of cases in the world of coronavirus. And what we need to do is stop the spread of coronavirus, and that's the best way to do that is incentivizing people to stay home. So that's actually exactly what we need right now. Right.
Well, there's a lot more to say there, and we'll continue to cover every week. But we'll turn our attention now to the feature of today's show. Again, we're talking about public banks today on 100.9 FM WXIR on Evidence of Design. This week, we had the pleasure to interview Walt McRee. He is let me back up 1 second. Let me rephrase a few things here. So, as mentioned, if you're paying attention to the news in Rochester, some folks have been really pushing to establish public banks. Mary Lupien, a local city council member in particular, has been pushing for that. She held a town hall earlier last month now because we're in August. So on July 7th, you can find that on YouTube by searching for Public Banking Town Hall or searching for Mary Lupien. And it was an hour-and-a-half town hall for folks to learn more about public banks and to hear from local institutions that would really benefit from public banks. And so we reached out to her for a statement, and Mary Lupien said, quote, "Forming a Rochester public bank would allow us to take back our public dollars from Wall Street banks and leverage them to increase investment in housing, education, public transportation, our small business economy, green infrastructure, jobs training programs, worker cooperatives, and improve our quality of life by correcting the historic inequitable investment in our city." So end quote there. You'll hear throughout the interview that a lot of the effects of working through the private banking system that municipalities have is that they're stuck in paying a lot of debt and debt service. And according to the City of Rochester's recently passed budget, 6% of the budget is spent on debt service. That's around $40 million. That is more than the amount the city spends on both the library and recreation youth service departments combined, just on debt service. So just to put that in perspective for you. So now let me introduce the two folks we interviewed this week about public banks. One, we talked with Walt McRee. He's been a national leader in the public banking movement since joining with the formative board of the Public Banking Institute. He served as former chair and CEO of the PBI and in recent years is now one of its senior advisors. Walt produces radio and TV programs for the Public Banking Institute, including the Progress Radio Network podcast called It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. He consults elected and other civic leaders around the country through his consultancy, Public Banking Associates. We also talked locally with someone, Melissa Marquez. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Genesee Co-op Federal Credit Union in Rochester, New York. That's a community development financial institution with $28 million in assets and 4,000 members. The Genesee Co-op Federal Credit Union is a founding member of the Rochester Public Banking Coalition and the New York State Equity Agenda Coalition. So let's turn our attention now to the interview. You're welcome to give us a call throughout the interview at 585-219-8889, 585-219-8889. Let's learn more about public banks together on 100.9 FM WXIR. The Small Business Administration's Paycheck Protection Program were released in May. Many were surprised to find that North Dakota received the most loans per worker than any other state. In the midst of the Great Recession, North Dakota had one of the most balanced budgets in the nation. And over the past 100 years, North Dakota has been able to weather natural disasters and economic shocks better in many ways than many other states. Now, why is that? The answer might have to do with the Bank of North Dakota, the only public bank in the United States. The Bank of North Dakota is a nonprofit institution. It's beholden to the people of North Dakota, not private shareholders. According to many, it's helped North Dakota successfully weather financial storms since its creation 100 years ago. But North Dakota may not have the only public bank for long. Recently, there's been a growing push in states from sea to shining sea to create public banks, including, most recently, right here in Rochester. And joining us on the phone to talk about public banks is Walt McRee, Senior Advisor at the Public Banking Institute, and Melissa Marquez, CEO of the Genesee Co-op Federal Credit Union. Walt, Melissa, thank you both for joining us on Evidence of Design. Now, I am probably way too excited than I ought to be to talk about public banks. I admittedly only started to really learn about the term and the movement around 2 weeks ago, and I'm genuinely really excited to have this conversation. Walt, if I may start with you, can you just give us a rundown about what is a public bank?
Sure, and thanks for having me on, Jason. Appreciate it. A public bank is a bank that's owned by the people of the city, county, or state. They kind of replace the equivalent stock shareholders in a private bank. And the bank is an institution that is so created by government, operated by professional bankers within that confines, and operated with a mission, with a purpose of serving the public interest as defined by the local people. It's not a bank that does retail business, at least not the not the kind of banking that you would go to, say, Melissa's bank for a car loan or a mortgage or whatever. The public bank, in the model that we talk about it, is along the lines of North Dakota, where it's a banker's bank. So it backs up the lending into the community, which credit unions and community banks are proficient at, and so we think they're very important parts. But the public bank helps to back up and enable more lending by these local institutions, because they share risk. They lower the cost of the money. They are able to put new programs into the community investment that other banks are not able to make, and that the big banks, the Wall Street banks, have really very little interest in making these days.
Why public banks? What benefits specifically do they provide to their communities?
Especially today, I mean, we see that in the last 10 years, private banks have been merged out of existence. The big banks have now dominate the market. The big banks of the Wall Street type, global types of banks, are not making local loans, so that the credit sources inside these local communities and economies have dried up in large part. And that really disables the economic potential and operations of an area. So the public bank then fills needs that are not met by the existing private bank structure. The private banks are of the Wall Street variety are what the cities, counties, and states have to typically rely on when they want to do things like build schools and bridges and so forth, because those monies are not in the state, city, county budget. They go to the bond market. That's Wall Street, and going to the Wall Street banks is enormously expensive and extracts that money out of the community. Whereas with a fully developed public bank, you would have the ability to lend that money to yourself, basically to the city, at much less expense, which keeps the money in the neighborhood. And so the interest that you pay for the money you borrow from your bank, which is typically a lot less, comes back to your bank. So it makes a very virtuous sort of what we would call counter-cyclical activity within the local economy. A huge difference between sending your money to Wall Street or putting it in your bank and keeping it at home to invest in yourself.
I had never thought about where the money that municipalities have, let's say the city of Rochester, to take one for example, like where does the city keep its money for its budget, for its $530 million budget? You're saying, Walt, that a lot of the money that municipalities use ends up going to private banks, particularly large ones, particularly ones that are heavily involved, let's say, in Wall Street or financialization or even speculation. And a lot of that money might not end up coming back into the community. And so a public bank might pose an alternative to that, where the cities or municipalities or communities' own money ends up feeding directly back into the community. Melissa, yeah. I'm guessing that the city doesn't have, the city of Rochester's budget doesn't go right into, let's say, the Genesee Co-op Federal Union. Can you give us an example of what a federal credit union is, just kind of for banking 101, that's different than a private bank, and it's also different than a public bank? Is that right?
Yes, it is. It is different than a public bank, as well as, a private bank. Credit unions are member-owned financial cooperatives. And as such, those who join the credit union as members elect the board of directors. It's a locally, owned and controlled institution that sets the policies and the frame and the mission and the purpose of the credit union. Credit unions are federally insured as a depository institution. And I wanted to give you, Jason, an example, though, of what we were just talking about, because the city of Rochester has about $255 million deposited in J.P. Morgan Chase. They have deposits in, I think, about 8 to 10 financial institutions altogether. But their largest depository institution is J.P. Morgan Chase, who also is number one for holding deposits of the residents of the Rochester area. But as an example, one would then think an institution like that would be investing, quite a bit of money into the local market. I've learned a couple of years ago that our little $25 million credit union, that's the size we were at the time, made more mortgages than J.P. Morgan Chase in the city of Rochester. And, so as soon as I learned that, and I began to realize we got to come up with another solution because we need more of a infrastructure and a system for investment into the city of Rochester than the one we have. And public banking is exactly the kind of model that I'm very excited about.
And if I may, I'd like to add to what Melissa said too. It's such an important point. When the city puts its deposits into a J.P. Morgan Chase or another large bank like that, those banks do whatever they want with that money. They'll gamble it on the casinos of speculation. They'll put it into projects and products that the public may have very little interest or actually would prefer that they not do. Some things include private prisons, fossil fuels, payday lenders, a whole host of things that the citizens would not like to have their money actively engaged with. So keeping the money at home allows the people, the bankers, your local banker, your public banker, to follow, as Melissa said, a mission that is observed and directed by community members who are on an advisory board or the board of directors, and they decide where the money where their commitments are and where they want to put their resources. So that's enormously powerful. And it really reflects on North Dakota's history of its stability during 2008, during that recession. Because North Dakota didn't have its money in Wall Street. It had its money all at home, and there was no slowdown in credit. The bankers there, the community bankers that control most of the deposits, unlike everywhere else in the country, made over 400% more loans to small businesses, as Melissa was saying, than average banks around the country. So it's a wonderful partnership between the community banks, credit unions, and the public banks, at least in North Dakota, and I think we're anticipating that everywhere.
I'm wondering if one of you could give me just a little bit of history of banking. I know that there are whole books on this, let's say, but the idea of a public bank isn't new. While right now there might be only one in the country as we've been talking about, North Dakota, I imagine that public banks were quite popular when we were a lot smaller and more grassroots or community oriented as a nation. And my guess is that the banking system has mirrored a lot of other institutions in our society that have trended towards homogenization or even monopoly, and that I would guess that big banks have really kind of bought out or closed in on smaller banks. Is that right? And have public banks been around for quite a while? Walt, maybe this is a place for you to start.
Yeah, actually, the first public bank in America was in the early 1700s, 1706. The Quakers started in Philadelphia. And it was really that model of public banking that made the American colonists so successful. They would simply extend credit to their residents whom they knew where they lived. They said, you want to start a business or a home or whatever? Yes, here's some credit. And they had 1% interest or small sort of a return like that. And that's really what got the colonies established. And it wasn't until 1764 when Franklin visited the king in England. The king asked him, how's it going over there? He says, oh, man, you won't find anybody happier than the American colonists. Meanwhile, the people in London are living in squalor on the streets. He says, well, why is that, Ben? And, Ben says, well, it's because we extend credit and people have the means to build their economy and everybody's happy. And that was the end of that. The king said, the king being the patron of the Bank of England said, no, you're not going to do that anymore. You'll get your money from us. and you'll pay us in gold, and that will be the end of it. So that actually later on Franklin said was really the reason why the American Revolution got started. People were deprived of having their own resources. Now, that's kind of a long way of saying that they've been around for a while, but I'll just add quickly before Melissa can contribute, and that is that the Germans built their economy on this, and they've been doing it for 300 years. Most of their banks, many of their banks are public and are funding their dramatic economic growth. And they're all over the world, China, Japan, Brazil, Russia, et cetera, et cetera. There are really a lot of public banks. About 25% of the world's deposits are in publicly owned banks.
And I would add to that, Jason, that all banks and credit unions are publicly chartered, right? You don't just get up and start a bank without having to go through a process of being chartered by a governing office. And that is, one of the reasons why, banks at one point when they were much smaller, and there hadn't been the kind of mergers and acquisitions that have basically created the too big to fail banking model that we're now in. When banks were small, they were more attentive to their communities. They got their charter, and that public charter, therefore, required them to provide access to credit. But more and more, with that too big to fail model, they really are. The system is now they're global giants, right? They're at a whole other level of investment and purpose and mission, and it's largely driven not by what's good for the public. It's driven by what's good for our private shareholders. So that's something important to understand.
Well, let me reintroduce you here. Thanks for joining us on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. You're listening to Evidence of Design, and this hour we're talking about public banking. Joining us on the phone is Walt McRee, Senior Advisor at the Public Banking Institute, and Melissa Marquez, CEO of the Genesee Co-op Federal Credit Union. We've talked about how North Dakota currently has the only public bank in the United States, but there's growing movement in many communities and states across the country to establish their own public banks, including right here in Rochester. Talking about our city budget again, Melissa, I know you brought up at a recent town hall hosted by Councilmember Mary Lupien that around 6% of the most recent city budget is taken up by debt services. And so we've covered the budget on this program before, and folks kind of know where to find that by just Googling the city budget. And there is a big old pie chart kind of right at the start of the budget where 6% of our city's budget is going to debt service, and that's around $40 million. That's far more than what the city spends on both the library and recreation and youth service departments combined. I'm wondering if a public bank would be able to lessen the burden that municipalities have to pay for perhaps capital projects or on debt. Is that one of the big things that public banking can provide?
Absolutely. The cost, as Walt has mentioned already, lowering the cost of financing is one of the most important benefits of the public banking model, because the bank itself is able to borrow from the discount window or at a discount rate, and therefore the cost of setting rates and what the cost of the financing is left to the financial institution. So when that financial institution is global, that cost is going to be higher. When it's set to, benefit the private shareholders, again, that cost will be higher than what a public bank would bring into the model. And in fact, public banks will often help to broker or get, lower cost financing as a mechanism for, paying for infrastructure of a city or a municipality.
Yeah, well, those costs are really pivotal to how the bank also builds equity by saving that money for the city. You can put it back into the bank, which then cycles it up. And the wonderful thing about having a banking franchise is, Melissa touched on one aspect that could be enormously valuable right now, as the federal government continues its stinginess with states and cities. In terms of the programs, the lending programs that it has, where it lends to corporations, banks, hedge funds at virtually free, almost no interest whatsoever. It makes the states and the cities pay market rates plus a penalty to take advantage of these new municipal liquidity facilities. Why do they do that? Because the Federal Reserve, our central bank, is really working in the interests of the private banks, not in the people. So what we call public banking is banking in the public interest. And it's because the people have the control, and the people decide what happens with the money. This is going to be increasingly important as in coming days as we all make our way through this economic collapse. If the Congress doesn't come up with its ability and its to be more generous and to put money into our neighborhoods and people, we're going to be in a heck of a fix. And if we had a public bank, if locally we had a public bank, the response, the ability, the options, the depth, the capital depth would change that landscape entirely. For example, and I suppose you alluded to it before, the payment protection program, the PPP, that the Bank of North Dakota outshined the rest of the country. On average, people in North Dakota got $5,000 in that program. That way outshone everybody else, and they did it quickly. And they did it quickly because the Bank of North Dakota has relationships with community banks and credit unions that they can automatically open up their channels for and be able to transmit and to, kind of almost like lungs, back to have an interchange between the bank and the people's needs and the financial needs.
I was going to bring up, and you mentioned that a public bank is supposed to be the banker's bank, and I was going to ask, well, isn't that the point of the Federal Reserve? But you're saying that the interests of a lot of our banking infrastructure is geared towards private shareholders rather than the people. Is that right?
Bingo. I would want to add one other thing into this, just in terms of immediate relevancy. Our credit union is predominantly a mortgage lender. So we, for the longest time, we were a consumer auto, lender, unsecured loan, personal loans, and we still do all of that and make very small, $300 or $500 loans to our members. But since 2009, we've really made our mark in terms of providing first-time homebuyer mortgage lending in the city of Rochester. And one of the realities for any mortgage lender is, especially because of fixed rate long-term mortgages, you need and have a secondary market, because as you're using up your capital, those loans often will be sold onto a secondary market rather than kept within your portfolio. Now, we do keep, almost all our mortgages, we keep them on our books and to get them seasoned. Many of our loans are not immediately saleable on the secondary market. But one of the big changes that I saw after the pandemic back in mid-March, suddenly the secondary market it still feels this way. They've closed their doors. What they'll approve is so premium and select that very few people, even people who would have normally gotten through and been approved to be sold are not saleable. And so everything is needing to be retained locally because the criteria has changed, because the secondary market that exists now has no appetite. That's the way we would talk about it. You know, they don't have an appetite for lending right now. And a public bank, you know, and I know this is a role that the North Dakota Bank plays, you know, for both benefiting community banks and credit unions, is they can help to participate in those loans, or we could even potentially sell a portion of our portfolio in order to enable us to make more loans to consumers for mortgages and other kinds of loans.
Yeah, that second mortgage or secondary market is very important to them. And again, it's one of the ways in which the bank helps to keep the assets in the state rather than selling them off to national markets or international markets and having them securitized in these fantasy finance sort of vehicles that have collapsed the economy before. Yeah.
When I first started to read about public banks recently, I was admittedly very quickly won over, and I was thinking, why aren't there public banks everywhere? They recycle money back into the community. They're community controlled. They might offer lower interest rates, loans, for instance. They probably have better relationships with the people who use the bank. Where is the opposition to public banks coming from? Is the reason why there are not a lot of public banks because there's a strong opposition, or is it kind of like an idea that for those in power, no one's really kind of made them happen?
Yeah, well, it's not that they're not popular. When we talk about this around the country, people say, well, this makes a lot of sense. How come we don't have this now? And the reason is basically the banking lobby does not like competition at all. It's just, get out of our sandbox. And then they'll put out aspersions that we can't manage risk and so forth and so on. But so they are the strongest opposition, the large banks. At the moment, community bankers tend to also be of that attitude. Not so much credit unions. In fact, we were delighted to see that credit unions are starting to sign on because we're very, very similar. Public banks and credit unions operate on the same principle of community collaboration and of support for public interest. But we think the community bankers are going to be along eventually, maybe in short order, because they're not getting particularly a good service from the big banks either. They're always up against wanting to, they have challenge making profits, and they, of course, are at some point they'd like to probably sell their bank and make a profit too. So the resistance comes from the industry. But again, around the world, they're proven to work very, very well. In fact, all of the global studies that I've seen have shown that public banks have stabilized economies locally and have that lasting effect that you really can't fight forever.
Melissa, I know you brought up some of the recent history of banks kind of failing their constituents or their members or their users, especially in that recent July town hall I mentioned. You brought up Wells Fargo, which was opening illegal accounts for customers without them knowing it. And there's Bank of America scandals. There's too big to fail idea that you mentioned. So in a nutshell, there's a lot of things to say that, well, banks have really kind of failed us. But why should people believe in banking at all? Perhaps it's a fringe idea, but I can hear kind of some people out there listening saying, well, I don't trust the idea of banking or, banking as a backbone of a capitalist society. Why is even a public bank worth believing in and fighting for?
Good question. For people who are skeptical of the, banking system in general, I think it might, maybe even a public bank could be a hard sell, right? Because they just are going to reject any notion of trust, right, in the money system that we have, and certainly the one that we have had, because the money is often controlling the purse strings, the power, right, at the public policy level because of that the lobbyists that they have. And they have money. That's the one thing. They have money to put into protecting their interests. So I completely understand why people might really just want to outright reject anything having to do with the word banking. But what I would say to that is, if not, then what? What are we left with? How do we, money is a bartering and exchange system, right? And so how do we keep this exchange continuing in a cooperative fashion and with upholding a public good, a public mission, and not in the private interest of a few? So that's, I think, would be my response.
And I would add, I think that she touches on a couple of really important points. But first of all, credit is the lifeblood of an economy. And the brilliant thing about banking is that it extends credit within some framework of regulatory control and management, credit that we all want to be able to have the lifeblood of our economy flow thoroughly. But also there's another dimension, I think, that's also part of the public banking movement and the new awareness, and that is that money is a relationship between people. And the system of banking is a relationship of trust. And those are values, systemic values and personal values, communal values that we want to bring back these days, as opposed to abrogating our relationships to the big guys who don't care what happens with our money or our communities. And it's because the community needs are so strong now that we really need to revitalize our credit unions and our community banks to get that money back to minority businesses, women-owned businesses, affordable housing, small business lending, all the things that the banks have been there for us. Banks have been really an essential part of our growth, and I think will continue to be.
Melissa, do you have a story to share about relationships with the Genesee Co-op Federal Credit Union and perhaps an impact that you've been able to make with someone's life through the services that the FCU provides?
Well, here's one thing I can tell you. The credit union has been a mortgage lender for more than 30 years. So we have members who've paid off their mortgages with us, but we have no experience with foreclosure. We've never foreclosed on a loan in our entire history, right? That's not to say we don't have members who haven't gotten into trouble with their mortgages. We do. We have members currently in trouble because of the pandemic. But speaking of what Walt was just talking about, relationships, we are in relationship to our members. And we are going to accompany them. That's the way we talk about it. We're accompanying them. We're walking with them as they are trying to solve their financial situation, at their kitchen table. And, the way I try to have all of our staff talk about it is we try to be at the kitchen table with our members, helping them figure out and solve how are they going to continue to make ends meet as they're facing challenges such as the one we are currently in. And even with our members who have lost employment, we're going to continue to walk with them and help them and figure out when will you be able to begin to repay your loan with us. We want to be there with them. And that is just a completely different approach to how to take risks, right? We don't look at people as a credit score. We look at them as a member who we're going to try to accompany and work with us. And of course, it's two-way. They have to be there with us. If they're putting their head in the sand and not responding to us, we will utilize ways to get them to repay us. But in the end, most of our members, that is such a small 0.01% of our membership that would completely walk away from us. Most everyone engages with us, and we figure out a way to repay. they figure out a way to repay us. Money it's the members' money. The members put money on the deposit, and we've then lent out the members' money, and we need our members to repay. So that's the basis of credit unions.
And I'll add a historical note to Melissa's a story about the foreclosures. The Bank of North Dakota, our only public bank, is 101 years old today, and yesterday actually. And during the Depression, when the farmers in North Dakota were without everything and the banks were coming in to foreclose, the public bank stepped in and said, look, we're not going to take your farm. We'll just create a moratorium here on mortgages, and we'll take care of it when things get back to normal. It's that kind of flexibility and commitment to the community that we're talking about, how important and how different it is. I mean, in the collapse of 2008, millions of people lost their homes by design of the big banks who were issuing these crummy mortgages, and moved people out. And now those homes are owned by investment companies, by private equity companies. Well, that sort of thing has just got to stop. And we think that the public can do that if they have their own bank.
Walt, can you tell us a little bit about the Public Banking Institute and how folks can get involved on the national stage to support public banking?
The Public Banking Institute started about 10 years ago. Ellen Brown wrote a book called Web of Debt that opened everybody's eyes to what we're trapped in here is this the extension of, is debt. And when she looked at North Dakota, somehow how it survived through the 2008 collapse, we started an institute out of that. And now around the country, there are like 35 states and cities that are engaged in one form or another. We're very excited to hear about Rochester's interest. It's one of many cities that are also kind of reading the writing on the wall of the financial prospects. We've got a very complete website at publicbankinginstitute.org. There's a tremendous amount of information there, videos, books, articles, etc. So anything you could possibly know would be that. And of course, we also do town halls around the country like this, the Zoom meetings where we talk with the elected representatives and civic leaders and so forth to answer questions and move things down the track a little bit further. So we look forward to having that opportunity maybe in Rochester one of these days soon. Thanks.
Melissa, can you comment locally on the public banking movement? Again, you've been involved, and Councilmember Mary Lupien has showed support in addition to some other folks. How does public banking look locally?
So the Rochester Public Banking Coalition was recently formed in part in response to there's an organization, Agenda Coalition. It's a New York State coalition, and they really are. There's actually legislation at the state level to support the establishing public banks for the municipal level. And so the Rochester Public Banking Coalition, really we have a Facebook page. In some ways I don't really like promoting it that way, but that's one way people can connect to us locally to find out what kind of activity and what is going on with the Rochester Public Banking Coalition.
Well, thank you both so much for taking time to join us on 100.9 FM WXIR and Evidence of Design, and for sharing about your work pushing for public banking and to make banks work in the interests of people and not private shareholders. We really appreciate you both joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
And we're back live now on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. You're listening to Evidence of Design, and this is Saturday, August 1st, 2020. This show is first airing. Thanks again to Walt McRee of the Public Banking Institute and Melissa Marquez of the Genesee Co-op Federal Credit Union for sharing about your work promoting public banking. Just as a reminder to folks, if you want to learn more about the Public Banking Institute, that's the national coalition that is providing support for folks around the country to start their own public banks. You can learn more at publicbankinginstitute.org. Pretty easy there to Google Public Banking Institute. And locally, as Melissa mentioned, there is the Rochester Public Banking Coalition that was just started. So if you want to get involved, you can find the Rochester Public Banking Coalition on Facebook. That will also come up for you if you Google Rochester Public Banking Coalition. And again, Mary Lupien, one of the council members, has been supporting public banking. She hosted a town hall on public banking on July 7th. You can find that on YouTube, on her YouTube channel, or by searching for Public Banking Town Hall. Other city council members were also in attendance and have expressed support, including Jackie Ortiz, Mitch Gruber, and Jose Pio. So 4 council members, at least to my knowledge, have showed support for the idea of starting public banking locally.
Jason, what a great initiative to have in the city of Rochester. And I was actually kind of curious, as we were listening to the interview, Walt mentioned the effect of public banks in Germany and how they've helped the German economy. And having lived in Germany for a couple of years and having banked in Germany, I was really curious as to whether I had participated in public banking or not. And so I just kind of quickly looked it up and discovered that the bank that I used, the Sparkasse, is actually a group of public banks. And just as a fun anecdote or I guess bit of information, the German public banking system actually has a 40% share of total banking assets in Germany, which when we consider that in the United States there's only one public bank in the entire country, that feels really significant. And it's kind of cool to just see that I had been participating in public banking without even knowing it.
That is really cool. What strikes me so much about learning about public banking is how obvious of a thing it should be. And it's just so weird how North Dakota, of all places, not poo-pooing North Dakota, but, North Dakota, of all places, has the only public bank in the U.S., and it's been there for over 100 years. It's like, what? And Walt mentioned that the private banking lobby is obviously not too keen to have public banks started because it would encroach on their power. And we don't have time to go into the role that the private banking system has played, the negative role that the private banking system has played recently. Walt mentioned a little bit about that, and so did Melissa, but one need not go back too far to the Great Recession and the financial collapse and see how the private banking system and their speculation and their short-term greed directly caused the loss of billions of dollars of wealth and ruined people's jobs and kicked them out of their homes and so on and so forth. And that's really problematic. And we've mentioned over and over again on the show how municipalities are always short on money, and how are we supposed to pay for our roads and our bridges and green infrastructure and all that, because we need to have austerity. But it's like, no, we
could pay less interest. I must say I was absolutely floored to realize how much interest the city of Rochester is paying just to hold its money somewhere.
Yeah, I don't know if the 6% of debt service the city has in its budget all goes to interest. I'm not sure. I looked at the budget, but it's you need to kind of understand those things, and I didn't. But the point that $40 million of the city's budget, 6% of it goes to debt service, which again is more than the city spends on all the libraries and recreation youth services departments combined. That to me is an issue, and that's kind of a waste of money, and it just sounds like if we were to have a public bank where the city could reinvest some of that money, and also the interest off the public bank could then go back right to the city, they wouldn't have to raise taxes as much or something. It's just getting this. I want us to get out of this cycle of always complaining about not having enough money, while a small amount of people are making a lot of money in this country. Do not tell me that we cannot pay for health care for everyone. We need to find a way. We can go to the moon, So we've talked about that before, but it's very frustrating, and the idea of public banking is really exciting to me.
Yeah, it's a really, really fascinating concept, and I appreciate you facilitating that interview.
Great. So there's a couple of directions we could take our last few minutes of the show, Mary. We could talk about how Donald Trump wants to cancel the November election.
Did he use cancel? I know that there was talk of postponing the November election. Get this, because the coronavirus is going to make mail-in ballots the big thing, and that is going to be a possible cause of fraud in the election. However, Trump does support absentee ballots, which you might say is the same thing as a mail-in ballot, and I would say is the same thing as a mail-in ballot.
It's the same thing. Mail-in voting is the same thing as absentee voting, because absentee voting goes in by mail. And by the way, there is no national proposal. There is no national plan. The November election is not planned to be all mail-in voting. That's a lie. It's spurious, and he's claiming that it's going to be all mail-in voting, even though he's the one in charge of the government. It's not planned to be all mail-in voting, and if he supports absentee voting, then that's the same thing as mail-in voting. And by the way, Donald Trump has voted by absentee multiple times because he has multiple places of residency, and so he's always traveling around, and so he himself has voted by absentee. We don't need to go into his mind. We know how we think about Donald Trump on this station. He's a crook. We think he's a crook. We think he's a liar. We think he's unfit for office. And we think he does not hold the interests of most American people in his heart. And the idea that we should postpone the election because of COVID-19, even though he's telling us all that we have to go back to work and go back to school, but we don't have the right to vote in November, is disgusting. And he's not fit for office, and he should be voted out of office at the least. He should have been impeached earlier, but the Senate Republicans didn't have any guts besides Mitt Romney. And so, here we are where we have this authoritarian and fascistic president who wants to postpone the November general election until he's somehow able to drum up a national crisis that makes his base support him, as opposed to the economic collapse and his complete utter failure to respond to COVID-19, among all other things that his administration's done in the past 3.5 years. So, this is just one other flag, and there's nothing more to say about Donald Trump,
we should keep saying what needs to be said, and this is, we could go on for a long time about this, but in short, this is an absolute threat to democracy, and just another threat after many, many threats to democracy that have happened during this administration and leading up to this administration that allowed this administration to happen. And we need to be very, very vigilant about these threats, make sure that we are able to vote on time, safely, and that we are allowed to have our voices heard.
Yeah. We are over time again. Thanks for tuning in to 100.9 FM WXIR and listening to Evidence of Design. Stay tuned for the Esquire Hour up next. They put on a great show. Thanks for tuning in to your grassroots public radio station. Speaking of public, well, you can support public banks too. Rochester Public Banking Coalition, or looking up the publicbankinginstitute.org. Until next Saturday, be well, be safe, take care. Bye-bye.